So continuing where I left off previously, which was I was kind of stuck right here in public policy and key pieces of legislation. Again, this is the competency and objective. Again, as a note, please make sure that you read the much more detailed PowerPoint slides that actually accompany this lecture video. Okay, so going to this now. So I ended with in this case the different waves of environmental policy and environmental laws. We are now on a timeline of significant environmental laws. So just to give you a clear vision here, first of all, this doesn't mean that there were no legislation about the environment previous to this timeline, but now we're talking about the modern era as we know it. So the first major environmental law that was passed in the 19 in this case actually in the early 60s is actually the Clean Air Act. Okay, the Clean Air Act addressed in this case it actually stands for this terrible acronym. It's called the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, NAAQS, and all that is it actually measures contaminants in the air, right? And in that case, ways to mitigate pollutants that actually goes into the air. The Clean Air Act, interestingly, addressed in this case parties that actually release pollutants. And when we talk about pollutants, we're primarily talking about volatile organic compounds. Gasoline is actually a volatile organic compound. That means to say it's something that is made up of carbon that actually then escapes very quickly into the gas phase. That's what volatile organic compound actually means. Now, just so that you know, so that this governs the type of emissions that actually comes from vehicles, from motorcycles, from airplanes, and it also governs the release of contaminants from, in this case, factories or from industrial stationary sources. These types of legislation are sometimes amended, and this act was actually amended in 1990 to add the ozone protection in 1990. And the reason why a lot of these acts get amended is science, gets some new knowledge about specific environmental phenomenon, and hopefully, and again, this is hopefully the government then acts on newfound data, newfound knowledge based on scientific and current good scientific research. Okay, so that is just an example of an environmental law that was passed. Another important thing is, I'm just going to skip through all of these things because the Solid Waste Disposal Act eventually got amended in 1976, and we're going to talk about that soon. The next big thing I want to talk about, specifically for us who live in Wisconsin, is the Safe Drinking and the Clean Water Act. Okay, the Safe Drinking Water Act was quite odd, and the reason why it was so odd was initially the big drive of this is obviously for drinking water. And the big component of this act, of this law, was actually treatment, water treatment. It did not address the actual source of the water. It didn't talk about underground water, aquifers, and all of that other things. So the big drive was you should treat water. That's basically, you should treat drinking water. That was the gist of the Safe Drinking Water Act. It was eventually amended, and it was amended to include as well, in this case, sources of water. So aquifers, okay, aquifers are in this case trapped waters under the earth. Okay, so that's what aquifers are. The other interesting about the Safe Drinking Water Act is the Safe Drinking Water Act is about drinking water, obviously, but it only governs, in this case, public sources of water. So, and the definition of sources of drinking water is quite interesting because if you have a private well that only serves less than 25 people continuously for less than 60 days, your well does not have to be governed by the Safe Drinking Water Act. The law, basically in this case, does not affect you. Okay, so that's a very big thing. So Safe Drinking Water Act in this case is what drives wastewater treatment. Okay, sewage treatment. Okay, so again, that's one thing. Oh, I misspoke. It shouldn't be sewage treatment. Okay, the sewage treatment eventually comes in the Clean Water Act, and the Clean Water Act is the difference between this is obviously this is about drinking water. The Clean Water Act, the main gist of the Clean Water Act was to make sure that waters, rivers, lakes, all of these things must be clean enough for people to swim in and to fish. Okay, so this is again the Clean Water Act. All right, so this is about recreation, primarily speaking. You must be, the waters like Michigan should be clean enough for you to fish and should be clean enough for you to like bathe in. Basically, that's what that means. Safe Drinking Water Act means water has to be safe enough for you to drink. All right, so that's that. What is missing here in, around 1976? Okay, it should be right here, right? So if I'm reading this right, is actually a amendment for the Solid Waste Disposal Act, which is actually called the like in this case Resource in this case Recovery, okay, and Conservation Act. Okay, so Resource Recovery and Conservation Act, or resource, however, like I think I'm mixing this up now. Okay, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act is actually what it's called. What that does is it is the legislation that governs, in this case, waste disposal. So we're talking about recycling, we're talking about garbage. Okay, previous to that, you could actually dump pollutants, right? You could dump, in this case, just poisonous substances on landfills. So in 1976, a law was passed that basically said, you cannot, okay, Toxic Substances Control Act, which was the RCRA, you cannot just dump hazardous substances in landfills. Well, obviously there was another amendment, because then in that case the petroleum industry started to like put waste underground, and interestingly this was primarily about, in this case, surface containment landfills. And so interestingly they had to modify that, because then of course underground storage of hazardous substances start to leak, and then of course they have to do some amendments there. All right, so that's a very important legislation. The other thing which is quite applicable to us in Sheboygan, Manitowoc countries is actually this huge, CERCLA. Okay, so CERCLA is actually called the Superfund site. What that does is, because of the clean, in this case, because of the law that was about, in this case, about hazardous substances, what happens was you need to clean up some of the sites now. So in Sheboygan, there was the Sheboygan River was heavily polluted by the Tecumseh Industries, right? So that was actually being, in fact, the lower river right now is still being cleaned, but the upper river and down the river was constantly being dredged, and the sediments were being cleaned consistently for the past few years or so. We're going to be talking more about, in this case, the Sheboygan River in the future, but just to give you, so Superfund, the reason why this is called Superfund is what happens was they taxed, okay, they actually taxed the, in this case, petroleum and chemical industries, which are the biggest producers, obviously, of toxic volatile organic compounds, PAH, PCBs. And again, these are just harmful substances that create you health problems like cancer, okay, reproductive defects, okay, makes the fish have 3 eyes, okay, so on and so forth. But this thing, so what happened was that there was a fine that was levied actually against the petroleum and chemical industries, and they actually got around $5 billion. Okay, and so that $5 billion became then a seed for them to create this fund to clean up contaminated sites. Now, eventually it transitioned from that type of fund, but now what happens now is, let's say Tecumseh Industries was responsible for the Sheboygan, primarily for the Sheboygan River spill or the Sheboygan River contamination. So what they've done was they would then go against Tecumseh Industries to pay for the cleanup. So this is about who is responsible for, in this case, for cleanup of contaminated, like areas. So that's one area. In Kohler, the Kohler landfill is also a Superfund site, and guess who's responsible for that? The Kohler companies would be responsible for that. There's also a legislation which is about the environment, kinda, but not quite, which is called the Food Security Act. This is called the Farm Act. Every 5 years, there's actually a Farm Act, and it's about agriculture. It's about, in this case, it's about funding for poor people, actually for people on welfare. So this is always a point of contention. The other thing that the Food Security Act is actually about subsidies to farmers, right? Like, so you can, this is actually where the laws that comes, where it tells you, okay, how much should I pay if you grow peanuts, if you're a farmer? How much should I pay you if your farm gets flooded during a heavy rainy season? How much should I pay you if you want to get off the dairy business and you want to sell off your whole herd? So this is actually so this is quite interestingly connected to Wisconsin, since we are a dairy and a farm state. Okay, so that's that. And every 5 years, okay, the most recent Food Security Act, or the most recent Farm Bill, actually was passed in 2018. So just to, and again, it's every 5 years that that legislation actually gets, in this case, revised. So so now switching gears, so now we're on the last learning objective for this competency, which is about systems thinking. There's two ways in which you can look at systems. One is hierarchical. Okay, hierarchical basically tells you the importance. In this case, the ecological systems are much more important than social systems or economic systems. Why? Well, let's think about this. Social systems are made up of humans, right? Economic systems are made up of humans. Well, there's no life on the planet if the ecological system in this case is non-existent. Okay, so very, very important. The other thing is called relationship based, and what this does is, so there's really no wrong or right way of answering this question. I prefer this because it tells you which one is important, right? But obviously we are the United States of America. We basically put, in this case, the same stock on whether it's an ecological, social, and economic system. You already have seen this. This is the three P's, right? Right? Planet, people, profit. Right? And so what you want to do every time that there's a problem, that there is something that either is on the environmental, social, economic aspect, is you want to make sure that all aspects of this whole system is actually considered, not just the environment, not just the social, not just the economic, but all of them. Okay? This is a much more complicated view in this case of systems thinking. So again, we're talking about systems thinking. How do you apply systems? The important thing about systems is you need to understand that in systems thinking, a system, by the way, means to say it's a multiple parts that together contribute for a common goal. All right, so that's what a system is. Okay, so think about our school as a system, right? The Wisconsin Technical College System is a system which is made up of multiple technical colleges, so on and so forth. Okay, but as you can see here, it's very convoluted, it's very confusing. Anytime you see a plus, that means to say that it has a positive effect in the number of tourists. Obviously, it's a positive effect for investment. But if you look at it, what happens is the number of tourists, okay, if you keep going, should also have a negative aspect. So if you keep looking, there's also negative aspects. So this is good. Okay, so illegal forest, because like in this case, if you have an illegal forest exploitation, well, that negates natural beauty. Okay, so sometimes there's positive, sometimes there's negative effects. So this is a key component of systems thinking. It's highly convoluted. The key is you want to incorporate as many components of the system as you can. Right? And obviously that leads to a lot of problems, because then the problem becomes like, you look at this and you say, oh gosh, I don't know how I'm gonna solve this problem, right? However, it is always, even if you, let's say, if you do not address one issue, let's say you just concentrate on the number of tourists, what you can then say to yourself is, well, I know that I haven't addressed this, which means to say that in 5 years time, more than likely that's going to be a problem, and I will then address it when that time comes. Okay, so the key is you want to do the least harm, because every single human activity will always have an advantage and disadvantage to other humans, right? So the key is you want to have the least negative consequences and the most positive outcomes. Okay, so that is actually the YouTube video that you're going to watch to actually post for your discussion board is actually going to be based upon systems thinking. I want you to, it's a very interesting video, read through it, and it's basically all about unintended consequences. Okay, so anytime we do something, always remember that just think of us, right? We are part of a family that has multiple people. Anything that we do affects other members of our immediate family. So just remember that.